Saturday, the 13th of February, 1982, Yitro. Please open the Chumashim to page 293. Page 293, Exodus chapter 19, verse 15. Vayomer el ha'am heyu nechonim lishloshet yamim al tikshu elisha. And he said, that is to say God, be prepared for the third day, come not near a woman. We are in the 19th chapter of Exodus, which is the preliminary instructions being given by God to the people before the revelation on Mount Sinai. I would like to ask the congregation what they make of that verse. What do they think the meaning is? Why is God telling Moses to tell the people that because he will reveal himself in 3 days on the top of Mount Sinai, they should not approach a woman? This is not a rhetorical question. For our visitors, I want to welcome you all today. We are an unusual synagogue in some respects, and one of the respects is that we act normal on occasions when people have bar mitzvahs, which is difficult for some people to get used to. We always study on Sabbath morning, and we do so today also. So the question is to our members, but also, of course, to our guests and visitors, whom I would be delighted to participate in the discussion. The question is simply, what reason do you think God had to ask Moses to ask the people not to come near women in view of the fact that the revelation was to take place on the third day? Is the question clear? I hope so. Any volunteers? Yes. Would you like to stand, and because we have difficulty listening? Well, it wasn't a question of prayer. God was going to reveal the Ten Commandments, right? So a visitor suggested that the reason why God told Moses to tell the Israelites not to draw near to women was because it was believed that, correct me if I'm not formulating what you said properly, because women would distract them. Is that right? Women would distract them. Okay? Any more offers on that one? There's no catch here. You're not going to be stung for a $1,000 contribution to the synagogue if you stand up. You're not buying something at an auction. Everybody looks terribly suspicious. Ain't anyone ever asked you an honest question before? We have a verse of our sacred Bible in front of us, and I'm asking you how it sits with you, and you all look dumbfounded. Yes?
Well, it's probably, I would assume, because of the ritual uncleanliness associated with women, especially with regard to the menstrual cycle. It's a sentence that nidas tumata, that nida elsewhere. So it's probably saying, because of the extreme holiness of the occasion, stay away from any sexual relations so you can be ritually pure.
Oh, well, Jerry has amplified it to include sexual relations, I presume. In other words, not just having coffee together or having lunch together, going for a walk together.
I assume it means when it says don't come near.
You assume, that's what it means. You assume the worst, Jerry. I hear what you say. Yes. Okay, we have two explanations provided by the congregation. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to proceed to ask for more, but I just want to make sure we know what they are. The first one is that God asks Moses to tell the Israelites not to approach women because women might distract the men, and so the men would not be in an appropriate psychological condition to listen to the revelation. If I ever misrepresent anybody, please let me know. Okay? That's the first suggestion. The second suggestion is based on, I should explain, in Orthodox Jewish tradition, a woman who menstruates is unclean. And in marriage, she must be separated totally from her husband for a period of at least 5 clear days after the cessation of the menstruating, after which she goes to what is known as a ritual bath or a mikveh. And only then may she resume sexual relations with her husband. And during that period, the woman may not touch the man and vice versa, and in very traditional circles, even more rigorous restrictions are applied. But I just wanted to fill any of you in who didn't know that into the picture. And Jerry Nadler's suggestion is, the second suggestion is that God wanted the people to be pure on the third day, and if the women folk would be menstruous, then they would not be pure to receive the Ten Commandments. Pamela? Could you stand, please? I'm sorry. Jerry has a very rich, plummy voice, but...
Whenever we read this kind of statement about man shall not, I always want to remind myself that practically everything we read is man shall not. That we should also say men and women should not. In other words, people should keep their separateness. But everything is seen from the male point of view. Men should not do this, and men should not do this. But we should also say people should not.
I think I hear what Pamela is saying to mean that the injunction is not against the woman as such, but simply because the idiom in which the Bible expresses its message tends to be a masculine image, and it puts it in such a way that the man should not approach the woman. What is really meant is a reciprocity here, that man should not approach woman, and woman should not approach man either. That's a very interesting point. Do we have any further observations? Ethel?
That period, during that culture, women were not counted in an ascent. They were pretty low down on the totem pole. So they were not given privilege.
Ethel says that in that society, women were very low down on the totem pole and therefore were not given the privilege of listening to God speaking, or at least not on the same level as men, because in fact, the entire people listened. But what you're saying is that the implication is, although it's not clearly stated, that somehow there was a mechitza, there was a kind of a separation between the men and the women. Since they were not allowed to touch each other, presumably it was a bit like the Western Wall in Jerusalem, where the men are on one side and the women are on the other side. We don't know, of course. Sir? By the way, if those of you in the back can't hear, there are two options you have to you. One is you can come up to the front. There's still some seats up here. And I will try to paraphrase what is being said. Yes?
Okay, Moses was ready to give God's word to the people of Israel, and there was an element of submission, and they would just have to really be ready to listen to the word of God. And I believe there's an idea of divide and conquer. If people would have had sex and had loving relationships, then they would have been close to each other, and possibly they wouldn't have wanted to listen to some Moses talking about some God. They would have said, well, we have everything, we have this bliss amongst ourselves. Why listen to any rules and regulations that you're going to force us on?
That's very interesting. The gentleman suggests that the reason why God didn't want the people to have sexual congress, sexual relations, was because they might get so much into each other they wouldn't listen to what God was saying. But I don't understand. People who make love on Monday night watch Brideshead Revisited anyway, and they enjoy it all the more. So I don't quite see why. It's an interesting point. I never thought of that before. In other words, you know, like sort of honeymoon sort of people. They don't hear what's going on. They sort of are freaked out, and God is saying, "Hey, you," and He can't break through to yes.
It's not just watching a TV show. It's listening to commandments, telling you that things aren't as good as you think, but you need these rules to help you and be better.
Mm-hmm. All right. So the gentleman suggests that sex interferes with listening to commandments.
Not good sex.
good sex. A very interesting distinction, if I may say so. A fine point. Just one moment. We have various... Jack was next, and then just one Jack, and then this gentleman in front, and then a couple of people behind. Yes?
The way in which this comes abruptly
Yep.
is reminiscent of the almost abrupt way in which we find the verse about thou shalt not see the kid in the milk of its mother. So it comes out of left field.
There's an English word for that, Jack. I'm sure you know it, and it's an interesting word. It's called apodictic, spelled A-P-O-D-I-C-T-I-C. And biblical scholars say that we can recognize the most primitive, most archaic, and earliest parts of the Bible by the extent of apodicity, or whatever the word is. That is to say, the more curt, peremptory, thou shalt not, these commandments, for example, do, don't, like this one, and that's an excellent point. This is an apodictic statement.
Now, the probability is that having advised the people that something remarkable is going to happen, it may have been a way of telling them, now this is nothing like the Canaanite and the pagan fertility rites that we're coming to. This is something different. This is something that is not reminiscent of the kind of religious behavior that you've been accustomed to. That's just a thing that derives from the way in which it's put, not necessarily
Yep. I like that very much, Jack, and I think it's a very, very excellent point. Jacob Snyder draws our attention to the fact that in the ancient Near East, especially in Canaan, the dominant mode of worship involved fertility rites. That is to say, good sex, if I may use that magnificent phrase of yours, was a central focus of worship. Under the Canaanite fertility rites, a man or a woman's divinity was as close to him or to her as their own genitals. That is the context in which the Hebraic religion emerged. And the fight between the Hebrews and the Canaanites was staged on this issue. The 18th chapter of Leviticus, which is read in synagogue on the afternoon of the Day of Atonement, at a time when the congregation is supposed to be all there to listen, stresses how God despises the Canaanites and their fertility rites, and how important it is for the Hebrews to be separate from them. So Jack's point is well made and well taken. Do not draw near to woman. Don't think this is going to be some kind of a sacred marriage such as you know takes place in Sumeria. The goddess and the god will not unite on Mount Sinai. There is only one God in Israel, no goddess. And there will be no sex on Mount Sinai, good or bad, because God, Yahweh, is asexual. We'll come back to that point. Excellent point, Jack. Thank you very much indeed. Bob? Do I have any more offers? Yes.
I think what's important is making the distinction between Kodesh and Kol, and just the idea of not mixing...
Could you stand here? I'm sorry.
What?
Could you stand? I can't hear.
Not mixing the sacred and the profane.
Right.
Similar to a marriage, when a husband and wife are separated the first week before marriage, it's really making that distinction and setting it, elevating it on a special pedestal. It's also, we've just now, historically, we've gone out of Egypt, we've made the departure, we've crossed the Red Sea, and now receiving the Ten Commandments, really making it special and unique.
That's a beautiful observation. The lady says that it has to do with the separation between the holy and the profane. Hamabdil being Kodesh L'chol. And that just as a bride and groom separate themselves for a week before the wedding, you seem to be talking about a long time ago, at least from the Upper West Side, as far as I'm concerned. I'm terribly impressed. I don't know where you come from. I have to find out later on. But wherever you do come from, obviously, they've never heard of premarital sex, which seems to be widespread among Jews. Jews are always first in any new field, and massively so. So the idea of separating for a week after you've been living together for 5 years is an interesting kind of anomaly, which does arise, halakhically speaking, on certain occasions, which we ought to discuss. But I think the main thrust of what you're saying is that you see this as an attempt to separate the holy from the profane. Do I have any more offers? Yes, sir.
The story was written, so far as I know, by men only. And there may possibly be more than a small amount of male sexism in the writing of it.
Mm-hmm.
And we really don't know.
Mm-hmm. Are you suggesting, sir, well, the gentleman said that all this stuff was written by men, and therefore he says that, are you suggesting, sir, that the Bible is sexist? I'm sorry.
I am not suggesting it.
Well, why don't you? It is. What? Oh, he is saying it. Good. I just wanted to make sure you bit the bullet. You are saying it. Could I hear it again, loud and clear, once more?
May I respectfully submit?
He says the Bible is sexist. Joe?
Yeah, going along with what was said about separation, if you take this point in context, it says, earlier it says, and thou shalt set bounds unto the people. And while the boundaries that are spoken about have to do with where they can stand, it also are boundaries between one another. It follows something.
I'm not sure, Joe. Joe says that the boundaries would sort of the same context, the separating boundaries between the people and the mountain would also apply to separating the men from the women. That's a slightly different thing. The traditional biblical view of God, and this may come as a surprise to those of you who haven't been here before, but it is a fact, as any plain, honest reading of the Bible will demonstrate, the original belief in God among our ancestors, as was the case with many other ancient peoples, was that God was, on the analogy of a very violent force of electricity, and that to come near God was fraught with the same danger that was involved in approaching a live electrical wire carrying thousands of volts. That one's state of mind, whether one was in a state of grace or not, whether one was good or evil, thinking positively or negatively, was quite irrelevant. In the same way that electricity makes no distinction between the righteous and the wicked, so also God doesn't. If you approach God inappropriately, if you approach him in his temple inappropriately, if you touch something which is sacred, inadvertently, you will be struck dead on the spot. The best example I can give is from the Bible itself, where a man called Uzzah is trying to help put the ark of God, which is falling off the ox cart. It's being brought back from the land of the Philistines after the Philistines captured it, and the oxen stumble in a furrow, and the ark is on the point of falling out of the wagon, and Uzzah puts his hand forward in all good faith to try to stop the ark from falling on the floor and breaking. And the Bible says God struck him dead on the spot. That is as close as we can get to the very primitive notion in the Bible, which in fact is expressed very clearly both in the reading this morning from the Torah and the reading from the Haftarah. All right, I'm sure you could think up some more answers, but let me give you a classical Jewish answer, the one that's given by the medieval Jewish commentator Rashi. Before doing so, however, notice that the late Dr. Hertz, of blessed memory, doesn't have anything to say at all on this topic, and this is a sound principle of certain kinds of Judaism. Let's not use denominations, that when in doubt, say nothing. That is to say, how on earth do you deal with something which says, do not draw near a woman? At least acknowledge that there's a problem there. Nächtigen Tag. Just carry on, hoping that nobody will notice, and in the next page, mark you, talk about the incredible vulgarity of the others, namely, let's turn to page 301, the note, verse 23. It says, don't make an altar of steps, because you may uncover your body when you're walking up the steps. Lest the clothes of the priest be disturbed and his limbs uncovered, it is a warning not only against the frantic indecencies of pagan rituals, but against all infractions of propriety in worship. The fact that in this very reading there is a frantic indecency perpetrated against half the human race apparently is not worthy of the late Dr. Hertz's comment. I just want to notice that in passing. Here is what Rashi, one of our best-known medieval commentators, an 11th century commentator, and I have a suspicion, although my knowledge does not take me that far, since there is no reference, Rashi usually gives a reference, that this is his own and not midrashic. And it's a very rare thing for Rashi to think for himself. As a good medieval Jew, everything that is good already has been said by those who are bigger and better. And one's prime religious obligation is to repeat that which is well known, well tested, and universally regarded as true. Only very rarely does a medieval commentator insert an opinion of his own. Do not draw near to a woman, Rashi says, that the reason is that in case sexual intercourse had taken place between a husband and a wife, say on Monday, there was a danger that the emissions during sex would still be around and maintain a condition of uncleanliness. The specific reference, curiously enough, is not to what Jerry said, the possibility that the woman might be menstruous, but to the fact that human sperm, male sperm, like all bodily fluids of this order, render impure. And therefore, they must separate for 3 days so that the women will be clean, so that they will be able to be v'tihiena tahorot lekabel Torah. The whole idea is that the women should be pure, ritually speaking, in order to receive the Torah. Now, isn't that a nice thing for Rashi to say? No wonder he had to think it up by himself. In all honesty to Rashi, unconsciously he must have been reacting to the violence of this statement. There's no way of accepting this interpretation, that the reason why men must not approach women was in case the sperm would still be wriggling around in 3 days, and therefore they would be impure to stand in front of the mountain. Because what about all other people afflicted with issue from the body? As a matter of fact, Rashi is a commentator on the Torah, and Rashi himself has a commentator. In traditional Judaism, everybody has a commentary on everybody. It's a kind of an infinite regress. Nobody is allowed to get away with it. And the commentator on Rashi says, but this is ridiculous. What about people who are suffering from other diseases? The lepers, those afflicted with various kinds of venereal diseases. Why weren't they given, if the issue was whether the women were clean, then why wasn't a general instruction given to all those who were suffering from impurity, ritual impurity, to get themselves to the nearest body of running water? Rashi's explanation clearly doesn't wash. I read a very disturbing book this week, which was published recently, a few months ago, by the University of Indiana. The book is called The Female Experience and the Nature of the Divine. It's a tragic book in some respects. It's not a great book. It's a fairly scholarly book, although the author is called Judith Oxhorn, O-C-H-S-H-O-R-N. She's a professor somewhere in Florida, and this book was published by the University of Indiana. The Female Experience and the Nature of the Divine. It was a traumatic experience to read. Although most of the information that I read I was aware of before, I don't think I had ever experienced it presented in this particular form. What Dr. Oxhorn has done, basically, is scour all the published material available from the ancient Near East and compare the polytheistic views of man-woman with the monotheistic views of man-woman. And the book, in this fashion, is an indictment against Jewish attitudes towards women. Biblical, should I say, attitudes towards women. Let's not get beyond that point. It's an indictment. There's no argument about it. And the plain meaning of draw not near women in the context of Dr. Oxhorn's book quite clearly is derogatory for women. It indicates that they are not as pure or as intelligent as men. And in fact, the full force of the book can only be seen by comparing what the polytheistic texts have to say as compared to what the Bible has to say. Now let me just enter a caveat first. I don't know whether we know what we're talking about right now, and I'll tell you why. If anybody in 2,000 years' time were to try to infer from the rules that you have to read before you take your driving test how people in New York State actually drove, the question we have to raise is, to what extent was there any correlation of any kind between what is preserved in the literature and what happened in actual life? So we are embarked on a problem which is fraught with so many difficulties. I can only hope to scratch the surface of the problem today and to caution you against coming to any hard and fast rules. I'm qualifying what I'm saying as based on the literature. I am not saying that if we could be all taken back 2,000 years ago to a day in ancient Sumeria, we might not find the same discrepancy between the way in which women were treated under polytheism and what the literature says, as distinguishes what the highway code says and what actually happens when people drive. Over Hanukkah, I was visiting my son in Jerusalem, and when Dallas is shown on Israeli television, the Arabs should attack because nobody would leave the television screen. Everybody in Israel is riveted to Dallas. It's the greatest thing that's happened in Israel. But that's not the only problem. Movies are losing their livelihoods. In fact, Dallas had to be moved from Saturday night to another night in the week because nobody was going to the movies on Saturday night. But that's not half of the problem. The main part of the problem is that every Israeli believes that everybody in America lives like the people in Dallas. Now, I have to admit, I've never watched Dallas. However, some of my best friends watch Dallas. And some of my friends whose intellect I admire enormously seem to manifest some kind of a lacuna in their intelligence when it comes to their obsession with Dallas. I don't know what it is, but somehow there is a magnetism which appeals to certain people deep down in their hearts. Now, all of us know that the relationship between whatever television puts on the screen and the reality of life is remote. If you want to see something that begins to resemble the way in which American life begins to be a little bit like, and even there it's totally distorted, go and see Shoot the Moon. But even there the distortion is massive, because in art one has to elevate things to a certain ideal form. I'm going to quote from polytheistic literature, or at least to give you a rough outline of what polytheism had to say about men and women, and gods and goddesses. And there's always the danger, the relationship between the literature that James Pritchard gathered together in a massive volume called Ancient Near Eastern Texts in Translation, is as removed from reality as Dallas is removed from reality also. So that's the first qualification. The second qualification is just because things happen at the same time does not mean that one affects the other. This is always the curse of those who deal in statistics. A correlation can be made between the number of bar mitzvahs at the SAJ and the birth of white mice in Central Park. But I don't think there's any real relationship between the two. No causality relationship. The fact that two things are happening at the same time in society does not necessarily mean that one thing has something to do with the other. So when I talk about monotheism and a terrible deterioration in the attitude of men towards women, I am not saying that monotheism caused that deterioration. But I am saying that in the Bible, that misogyny, which is what it is, apparently is compatible with biblical literature, whatever happened in real life. And let me tell you very simply what the situation is. Under polytheism, there were women rabbis. I can't put it more simply. No distinction was made under polytheism in terms of the texts that have come down to us from the past. No distinction was made, more or less. There are always qualifications, there are always exceptions, between gods and goddesses. Gods and goddesses had different powers, but the issue of power had nothing to do with gender. Gender was not a consideration, either in the nature of the divine, nor in the cult. Men and women served as votaries, as devotees, as priests and priestesses, without any distinction whatsoever in terms of their efficacy and power under the cult. There were male rabbis and female rabbis. I'm using this image because it's very interesting. that polytheism is again rearing its head in our own modern day. And the whole question of why it was that Judaism turned against this has also to be raised. And this was the order of the day, more or less, with the issue of power not being based on gender, the cult, the ritual, the liturgy, the myth, and the divine not being based on gender, any difference being made whether you're a man or a woman, until monotheism came onto the scene. And with monotheism, we have a radical degradation of the woman, which is manifest throughout the Bible on every level. What is most interesting about Dr. Oxhorn's book is that she does not deny any of the evidence against this thesis. Those of you who have been interested in recent years in following the way in which women, both within the Jewish community and within the Christian community, have desperately, those who are concerned with the Bible, those who come from traditional backgrounds, those who care to salvage something of tradition, those who have an attachment to tradition so that they can't just say, throw it all into the garbage can and let's start from scratch. Such women have wrestled with this problem. Rosemary Rooter, Mary Daly, Phyllis Tribble specifically, who wrote a magnificent article many, many years ago now, which appears in just about every anthology, an attempt to show that even though the Bible manifestly is sexist, male and chauvinistic, piggish, if you really try to do a Talmudic dray, which for a non-Jew she does remarkably well, you know, this isn't that and that isn't the other, and in the end, they really like women. She picks the Song of Songs, which is the least sexist book in the entire Bible, and tries to show that the biblical tradition may in fact be depatriarchalized. Dr. Oxhorn radically disagrees. She does not deny that occasionally you have a Yael, you occasionally have a Deborah, as we read about last week. You occasionally have a Rachel, a Sarah, a Rebecca, and a Leah. But by and large, the Bible is anti-woman, as indeed is Orthodox Judaism. And the very Ten Commandments are themselves a commentary on what the meaning of draw not near to woman means. For the seventh commandment, which runs, thou shalt not commit adultery, is the most grossly inequitable of all the Ten Commandments. In Jewish tradition, only a married woman technically commits adultery, or only with a married woman, a married Jewish woman, may adultery take place in a strict connotation of that sense, which is why all the problems relating to divorce today in Jewish circles crop up. When a Jewish man is married to a Jewish woman, they decide to get divorced. According to Orthodox Jewish law, the man may remarry Jewishly even though he has not divorced his wife. The wife is permanently bound to the man according to Jewish law and is his wife till she live 1,000 years. And if she remarries, she may not under Orthodox Jewish law because she will be living in sin. She will be committing adultery. That is the seventh commandment, a preparation for which is the command, draw not near woman. I think we can understand the meaning of draw not near woman now in terms of the context. There's no question about its misogynistic underpinning. I don't want to proceed on this point much further at this time. The evidence is there, and those of you who are into this, I earnestly advise you, as I have advised several of my pupils this week, to purchase this book. It's a good textbook to start worrying about what it means to have women rabbis today. Are we becoming pagan, which is what Richard Rubinstein has been telling us for the last 20 years? Are we no longer Jewish? And is this attempt for unisex, this attempt in our society to create a society in which men and women will be interchangeable, including to the raising of children, desirable from a psychological, a mythical, or a religious point of view? I'm raising the question. I'm not making any statements. See my attorneys after the service. I don't know. Why did the Jewish people turn against polytheism? Why did the Jewish people change in such a radical way? Now, lest you believe that since monotheism apparently is compatible with a misogynistic approach, you may think there is nothing valuable in monotheism. You would be grossly misled. Monotheism was perhaps not only inevitable, it was necessary. Monotheism was evolutionary. One almost might say that monotheism was inevitable as lizards and reptiles were necessary over amoeba and protoplasm and algae. One almost might say that monotheism was necessary from an evolutionary point of view as mammals were over fish and as man is over animal. What is it that is at the heart of the enormous monotheistic contribution to human life, not to Jewish life? In 1949, a scholar by the name of Leonard Silman wrote a brilliant article called Monotheism and the Sense of Reality. And in that article, he shows how the crucial difference between monotheism and polytheism was very simply the difference between maturation and infantilism. That under polytheism, the highest level of psychological development that can take place, at best, is infantile. That only under monotheism can human beings enter their full stature as men and women. Well, as men anyway. You see, in polytheism, all is one and one is all. The classical image, of course, is the doctrine of consubstantiality as it applies to Egyptian religion, where the Pharaoh is himself, but he is also his father, and he is also his son, he is also the sky, and he is also the river, and he is also his people, and they are him. And so that life becomes one morass of molasses in which temporary fleeting shapes merge eternally and infinitely with other equally changing kaleidoscopic patterns. But that nothing can be pinned down. Protean style, everything shifts into everything else. These ideas are at the foundation of Eastern mysticism, which is so popular among our Jewish men and women in this day and age. The notion that the goal of life is to melt into the larger mass and forget one's own individuality. That the goal of life is to melt as a grain of salt in the ocean. That to extinguish one's individuality and become part of the rhythm of the cosmos. This is crucial and central to polytheistic views in general and polytheistic mysticism in particular. In polytheistic mysticism, the goal is to lose self and to experience a situation in which there is no clear-cut demarcation or division between anything in the cosmos. Monotheism is radically different. The central theme in monotheism, with which our own Jewish Bible begins, is Vayavdel, Havdalah, separation and individuation. You cannot find a greater stress anywhere than in the Bible, which is the classical text for monotheism, than the importance to separate. Israel must be separated from the nations. Men must be separated from women. Adults must be separated from children. The holy must be separated from the profane. Hamavdil bin kodesh l'chol, or la'choshech, Yisrael la'amim, Yom ha'shvi'i l'sheshet yemei ha'maseh, the Sabbath from the weekday, Israel from the Gentiles, light from darkness. The whole ethos of the Bible is based on individuation and separation. And the central thrust of monotheism, which was not made cognitively understandable until 2,000 years later in the massive works of men like Jung and Freud and their followers, is that without separation, without human beings radically breaking away from where they come from, human beings cannot grow to their full individuation and maturation. And many people simply don't want to face that because it's easier not to separate. It's easier to simply repeat. It's easier to simply merge. It's easier to be jelly rather than rigidly defined. I and thou in the Jewish tradition is separate. And so unlike Judaism is that its God is radically other. My ways are not your ways, says God. As far as east is from the west, so far is my way from your way, and your thoughts from my thoughts. Three things emerge with the emergence of monotheism. A God who is unique, asexual, neither man nor woman, and radically other than his creation. God man, and nature are three absolutely, totally separated entities, and none of the three shall ever meet. In the 19th Psalm, which is a revolutionary tract, as is all the Bible if understood properly, we read, Hashamayim mesaprim kavod el, the heavens declare the glory of God. No ancient pagan or polytheist could have written that sentence. In the pagan polytheistic viewpoint, the heavens were God. Only under monotheism could the statement, the outrageous statement, have been made that the heavens declare the glory of God. They are God's creation. God, nature, man. That is to say, only with monotheism, only with a religion which insisted on the radical otherness of God, could human beings have moved on to what we call today civilization. Without oversimplifying in any way, it is universally recognized by scholars that without the unity of perspective afforded by the sentence Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, science, as we understand it today, would not have been possible. The scientific attitude was born within the matrix of the three great monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It is true, the Far East had some science, but the Industrial Revolution crucially takes place within soil that has been fertilized for centuries by the insistence that the world is one. Without that insistence, we could never have arrived at E equals mc squared. Without that insistence, we could never have arrived at Copernicus or Darwin or Marx or Freud or Jung. But our problems don't end there. In a tragic sense, monotheism, created by the Hebrews, became the destroyer of the Hebrews. Neither would the Holocaust have been possible without monotheism. And there's a direct line between monotheism and the Holocaust. Under polytheism, that particular experience, which we call the Holocaust of Europe during the Second World War, is unthinkable. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not opting for life under the Aztecs, unless I'm an Aztec, preferably an Aztec priest. I don't want to be one of the guys who, and nobody else does. But I invite you to reflect on whether the articles that many of us are currently reading in the New Yorker magazine of what we have wrought with our Adonai Echad and our wonderful science, what we now have at our disposal, what we can only do to ourselves, and what the Jews have already had done to them. I'm not blaming the Jews. You can't think 2,000 years ahead of where your new ideals are going to lead you. Max Weber understood this perfectly. As far as I understand Weber, monotheism was a way station on the way to the modern bureaucratic world. In order to wean people away from polytheism, you can't move them straight into the Industrial Revolution. People who are primitive and infantile and archaic cannot be made to grow up overnight. It's a long and slow process. Sometimes in order to go from there to there, you have to go to there and live very intensely in there before you can move from there to there. That is to say, there are certain psychic processes which cannot take place from there to there, but have to go through a way station. Monotheism apparently was such a way station. The world had to be, before the thrall of polytheism could have been broken, before human beings could emancipate themselves from the thrall of polytheism. If you regard polytheism as a thrall, some of my best friends think that separation is a bad word. It all is a question of where you're at. Before that thrall could be broken, first, God had to be removed from the cosmos altogether, and a radical difference made between man and nature. Nature had to be bereft of God, and man also accepts insofar as he obeyed God because he was created in the image of God. And the obvious conclusion, of course, is that when you move from the way station of monotheism to modern life, or postmodern life, and you lose the belief in the God of monotheism, you are left with a nature and people in whom divinity no longer resides as they do in polytheism. Among ancient savages and among modern savages, when an enemy is killed in battle, part of the deceased is eaten by the victor as a sign of respect for the karma, for the power, for the mana, the vitality, a respect. Well, you might want to show your respect in other ways, but I just want to dwell on this for a moment. Here you've had a fight with somebody, a warrior, fought well, but finally you killed him. You eat part of his brain. You're too squeamish, you don't like that. Let me tell you something, dear friends. In a world in which even your enemies have to be treated with respect, Eichmann's could not have functioned. The only way the Holocaust became possible was because it was possible to declare a whole race of people staatlos, which meant that they were not only without a state, but also without God, because monotheism already has placed the center of divinity in the supernatural being who is over and against nature. This is the kind of tragedy that one often greets when one speaks to parents of children who are growing up, who are acting out, and the mother or the father say with a poignance that is almost intolerable for those of us who have to listen to this kind of talk, but we did everything the best for the child. We tried to do everything we thought that was the best thing for the child. We did that, we gave the child this and that and the other because we really believed that was the best for the child. The way to hell is paved with such intentions. Hitler was able to do his job that much more easily because he did it in a world which had paved the way for him through monotheism, as Max Weber clearly understood. And the central challenge of our age, and maybe it's too late, is to try to use the insights of monotheism for the purposes they were meant. What was monotheism about? It was about reality. What was monotheism about? We couldn't do better than go to the first midrash, which we all studied when we were children, about how Abraham was brought up in a family of idol worshippers and recognized very soon that the idols were not worthy of being worshipped because they were made by man. And then he worshipped the sun, but the sun set. And then he worshipped the moon, but the moon set. And then he worshipped the stars, and the stars disappeared. And Abraham said, surely there must be something behind this manifold of manifest appearances which is eternal, abstract, and underpins all else. The Jewish idea of God is pure atheism. If God is inevitable, if God cannot be expressed in words, and he is ineffable, if God cannot be portrayed in clay, in stone, or in pigment, what kind of a God is he? The attempt that monotheism makes is to help people to achieve a way of looking at reality which is honest, which is not confused and clouded by wishes and fantasies. It is against the infantile mode of relating to the world in terms of what we would like, and instead relating to the world as it actually is. God becomes omniscient. He watches over us in the monotheistic spirit. He knows all our thoughts. He searches our hearts and our reins. What better kind of mythological context in which human beings can grapple with reality when all the time, every minute of the day and night, the verse Shiviti Adonai lenegdi tamid, which is the opening sentence quoted in the Shulchan Aruch, I have set God before me continually. It is an urge towards synthesis. It's an urge towards making ideas become reconciled with one another. It is the most potent antidote to magical and animistic thinking. Or to use more sophisticated language, it is a challenge to reality thinking, to secondary process rather than primary process. But something went wrong. Human nature didn't change. Einstein didn't create the atom bomb. Einstein was one of the most lovable people around. But as the articles in the current issues of the New Yorker make it quite clear, E equals mc2 squared led to the hydrogen bomb as surely as the Jewish Bible, monotheism, led to the Holocaust. I'm not saying it's causal. I'm saying there's a relationship. We had a bar mitzvah today. I said to the father of the bar mitzvah, boy, you know what we say on these occasions? When a child is born, a male child, we say, LeTorah, LeChuppah, u'Ma'asim Tovim. LeTorah means may he become bar mitzvah. Chuppah means may he get married. Ma'asim Tovim, may he perform good deeds. The goal of Jewish life is to add ethical insight to the scientific products of monotheism. Man has to get his act together. Human beings have got to get their act together. We have all the possibility within our midst of creating a better world for all mankind or destroying ourselves. Never before have we been at such a crossroads. See, in the ancient world, if you wanted to kill, you had to bite somebody's neck. After a while, even necks begin to pall. You know, I mean, no matter however angry you are, how many necks can you bite? 2 necks, 3 necks, 6 necks. There's a guy over there who did 18 last week. But after a while, if you have to kill somebody with your bare hands, when all you have to do is to press a button, and you can create Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and the description, the actual descriptions, which none of us want to hear or understand, of what happened 10 minutes after that bomb exploded. We don't understand that. The central thrust of these series of articles, by the way, really was anticipated long ago by Robert J. Lifton. And although he's quoted in these articles, he should be given much more credit. It was Robert J. Lifton who first began to understand the need of working with survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to understand the central challenge of the 20th century. What happens when this kind of thing happens? We in the West deny what happened then and what could happen. We carry on business as usual. We Jews, perhaps more than any, have to try to understand seriously where we come from, what happens, where we are going. Omniscience in God created the notion that man could be omniscient too. And who would have credited modern man with journeying into space and the miracles of medical, surgical, scientific, and other innovation? But there's another kind of innovation which modern man has not been able to perform. Our science may be 1982 of the Common Era. Our morality is 1982 of the pre-Christian era. In terms of our behavior, in terms of our ability to distinguish between good and evil, in terms of our ability to use our God-given gifts and our God-given creativity to further humanity rather than to destroy humanity, is true not only in the world at large, but tragically in our own country at this very moment. We are unable to see that it is the quality of a civilization that counts, not its strength in potential overkill, and that the quality of the life of the meanest and least of our citizens is a measure of the greatness of our civilization, not the number of megaton bombs we can deliver onto our enemies, only to have them visited on us instead. The Ten Commandments, how quaint, how discomforting, how primitive, and yet how challenging. You don't have to believe in a supernatural God, as we here don't. You don't have to believe in any kind of a God. You only have to believe that at least some of the motivations that led to those Ten Commandments, the idea that there are certain things that pass, and certain things, as we say in Yiddish, pass nicht, in the way we treat human beings, in the way we treat ourselves, and the way we treat nature. We rise for Aleinu on page 192.